So delighted to be joined on the show today by practical effects artist Dan Martin. Dan, how are you doing?
Hey, yeah, I'm all good, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks very much for joining us. I know you've probably a very busy man. As you said, we're just kind of talking off recording about the kind of new studio and everything getting set up. So just a brief introduction really for yourself, for anyone who doesn't know you that's watching.
So I'm a figurative and makeup effects designer. I've been working predominantly in British cinema, but doing some stuff internationally over the last 20 years. Got my start in indie British stuff, but kind of made a splash when I got to do the second Human Centipede. Since then, I've been lucky enough to work repeatedly with some fantastic talent from England and abroad. I've done a lot of films with Ben Wheatley that people may have seen, starting with Sightseers, although we did a short film before that my wife produced. That's how I met him. And then I've worked with Harmony Korine, done a couple of films with Brandon Cronenberg, Jonas Ackerland, Richard Stanley. I've been lucky to sort of get to work with some really fantastic directors. And I think special effects is one of those things where you can do great work in bad films and people don't really notice it. But if you're lucky enough to get to do what you love in good films or great films, then that's when people really pay attention. So I've been very lucky to sort of have the spotlight on me for that reason.
Yeah. Good stuff. And we'll come on to your credits and your back catalogue, but you mentioned there that first kind of breakout was Human Centipede 2. I am not an extreme horror one, but I'd done an episode with Mary Wilde. And we have a kind of on Road to Nowhere, we have a sort of subsection where we get a guest on to discuss one of their favourite directors, and Mary picked Human Centipede 1, 2 and 3 to discuss, which was interesting to say the least. Human Centipede 2 is it's so hard to watch, but that means you've obviously done really, really great work. So did
you watch the uncut version as well? Or did you watch the UK print?
I can't remember. It was maybe close to a year ago now. It had a scene with a baby getting crushed.
If you saw the baby get crushed, then you saw the uncut version.
Yeah, it is a hard watch. I think it's I think it's the film that I have felt it under my fingernails ever since. It was a really dirty feeling movie, but talking about obviously your own work on that, how did the kind of break for that come along? We're working with Tom Six and things like that.
So I was actually very lucky to be associated with that at all, because Tom and Alona had obviously no idea who I was at that point in my career. When I first started out, I got a job with I won't name them, but with a terrible effects house. Not that their work was particularly bad; they just didn't fucking pay anyone in West London. And I worked with them for a while, and they did more kind of miniatures and rigs than what I do. Right. Although obviously I can turn my hand to that. And I was with them for a while, and they had a couple of jobs come in that needed someone who was more aligned with my kind of stuff, and they had a specialist come in to sort of run those jobs by the name of John Schoonrad, and I was just sort of handed to John as an assistant because I knew my way around stuff. And actually initially the very first thing I did with John was a music video for The Darkness. They did a Christmas single called Don't Let the Bells End. And I made Justin's teeth for that because I'd done some dental lab tech stuff when I was younger. And John and I got on very well. I was sort of handed to John as someone to sort of make sure he didn't burn down the workshop because he's quite a big worker. And off the back of that, I ended up doing some stuff for John at his company as he was setting up. John's got a fantastic sort of back catalogue. He started at Henson's, which is where I don't think I ever met John. So I did a brief stint at Henson's before they closed in London, and I don't think I met John, but I'd heard of him through that. Mm-hmm. He was their head of live casting, and then he set up his own company called Livecast. So I went and worked for him for a little bit when I left that other place. And then John had done. I'm probably going to fuck up the timeline on this, but John had done the first Kick-Ass picture.
Oh,
Made
cool.
a bunch of bodies and makeups and stuff for that. And then that was one of the first big jobs that his company had taken on. And then he got the call for Human Centipede 2, and he'd done about a week of work on Human Centipede 2 before like a big job came in. He did he did the fourth Rambo picture as well, all that fucking great like limb cutting and all that kind of stuff as well. So John was suddenly like being whisked away to this big job, and he just phoned me up and he's like, "Dan, do you want to take over this second Human Centipede picture?" I'm like, "Yeah, of course I do." So I did a couple of weeks of stuff in his studio, and then we relocated it to my studio at the time, which was just a tiny little artist space in Elephant and Castle at the time, which coincidentally was about 5-10 minutes up the road from where we were shooting the interior locations for Human Centipede 2, which was in an old, like it's 1970s car showroom that's since been demolished. Beautiful old place, big glass ceilings on the Old Kent Road. And so I was really able to sort of get stuck in with sort of playing around with that, and I think I made quite an impression with Tom because. Like right at the beginning, I was sort of reading the script and I said, do you really want to spend money on all this stuff? Like every country in the world's going to cut this. Like you're not going to be allowed to show any of this. And he was like, well, that's the fucking point. Like I want to get banned. Like after the success of the first film, everyone came back and was complaining that, oh, it's not as extreme as everyone says it was. He's like, so fuck them. I'll give them the most extreme film they've ever seen. And I was like, oh, okay, we're making Salo. I get it. Like, this is a Pasolini move. So then, as soon as I knew that that's what was going on, I was sort of free to start saying, oh, but what if we did this? You know, we could push it a little bit further. So that baby crush is mine. Like, that wasn't in the script. We were filming that last sequence, and I sort of pulled Tom aside and I said, what if the baby went under the accelerator pedal, and to escape, she has to crush the head of her own newborn child, like a sort of Sophie's Choice, but with like they both die, or just the kid dies, because like if she doesn't do it, he's going to get them. And Tom was like, that's fucking amazing. Yeah, let's do that. Can you make that happen? And I said, yeah, push the shot till after lunch and I'll make it happen, because we were just around the corner from the workshop, so I had access to all my kit, and that was fantastic. And there was like 5-6 of us on that film. Like it was a really small crew. Yeah. But it was absolutely fantastic, and obviously, you know, it played all the festivals, and all the controversy helped hugely. First film to be banned in England in however many years, 20 years, whatever it was. So that was, suddenly I was on the horror map. And around about the same time as that, I got to work with Ben for the first time, and it sort of all took off from there. Yeah.
It's I will say one thing for Tom Six. He certainly he takes swings, because even the third one as well is just wild. Probably, and it's no offense, but I don't think I'll watch them again. It's just that I'm really, I'm honest, I struggle so much with the extreme stuff, and like I talk a lot to Zoe Rose Smith as well, and she's obviously right into it, and I get some recommendations through from her, and I kind of steer clear of them a wee bit. Megan is Missing, I think, was the last one I watched, and I can't be doing with that. So I'll kind of go back a wee bit, actually. So in terms of getting into the industry initially, was that what you was the kind of practical effects that you do? Was that what you wanted to do from the start, or did it kind of develop as a want?
Yeah, I mean, I've loved film for as long as I can remember. I had a slightly weird relationship with it when I was a kid, because we didn't have a TV. My mother was very anti like TV conceptual, and I think that in her mind, in the early 80s, TV and cinema were separate things. Right, okay. So I didn't have access to a lot of that stuff. So I'd be watching it at friends' houses, or like I remember. Like I just wanted to watch TV, like anything on the screen. And a friend of mine who lived around the corner, like when I was a kid, her dad really liked Laurel and Hardy, and I would just turn up at their house and I'd say, "Oh, I think there's a Laurel and Hardy movie on this afternoon," and then we'd just watch whatever was on, because I was fucking lying. Like we just watch whatever was on, and I assume he knew what I was doing after the first one of those. So as soon as I had the ability to watch stuff, like I briefly went to a very posh boarding school before I was expelled. So I was there for like a year and a quarter, I think. And I was leaving the dormitory every night and breaking into the AV room with video cassettes that I'd bought at a market, like bootlegs I bought at a market, a couple of things I shoplifted as a kid because they wouldn't sell me, Full Metal Jacket or Romper Stomper or these 18 titles that I wanted to watch, and we'd just go and Jimmy open the AV room at this school and watch things on the big screen, like semi-big screen, like one of those old-fashioned big rear projection TVs. Yeah, and just consuming as much of this stuff as I could. And I remember I had my dormitory bed, those sort of like weird little thin mattress single beds you get in hostels. So those are the beds in the thing. And my bed was like 2 inches higher than everyone else's because it had a layer of video cassettes underneath it that I'd like collected from various places. But I developed a code to label them because I didn't want to, if they got found, I didn't want anyone knowing what they were because they were all things that I was like 12 at this point. So I'd use parcel tape to rip the labels off the things, and then I'd write on them, and then I had a notebook that said what each one of those was. But then eventually I got caught, and I remember one of my teachers sent a letter to my mother saying how like outlandish and awful it was that I had access to these horror movies, and he wrote down the titles of some of the films that he'd found because I'd kept the sleeves, like I didn't throw them away, but I'd kept them separately. Okay. And he'd gone through and he'd obviously figured out that's what was going on, that these were related to the unmarked tapes that I had. But I was so indignant that he had written the taglines as though they were part of the movie. Like, obviously very much not the thing to focus on while you're being incredibly told off for so wildly going against all of the rules. But I remember he called Serpent in the Rainbow, don't bury me, I'm not dead. And I was like, well, that's not the name of the film. That's the name of the film, and then also the tagline. Of course that's going to sound worse than it is.
If you're giving me into trouble, at least do it fucking properly.
Yeah, get it right. Tell me off for the right thing. Yeah. So I was a little bit before that, like when I was young, I was a magic nerd. I was into like card tricks and sleight of hand and that kind of stuff. Yeah. And then I read a book about special effects and particularly monsters and horror effects and that kind of stuff, and it just kind of clicked. Like I was like, oh well, this is magic tricks, but it's magic tricks for a thing that I think is very cool. So immediately that became what I wanted to do. And then I was very lucky in that I met a handful of very good people who gave me advice over the years, whether it was like, guidance in the industry or technical advice. And I'm quite tenacious. And I would follow up on these things, and I was, I was lucky enough to meet the right people to put me in touch with the right people.
No, nice. And growing up, obviously, of that kind of horror era, would it be safe to say like influences would have been Stan Winston and Henson and things like that from that era? Would that have been your influences for who you would look up to in terms of making things?
I mean, I think at the beginning, certainly the one name that really resonated with me was Savini, and like, to be brutally honest, Savini is not at the level of your Winstons and your Bottins and your Bakers, but he was a very, very good publicist for himself. He was the first human on the front cover of Fangoria magazine without any makeup on. Like he did some good stuff to get the knowledge of makeup effects out. And those two books that he released, Grand Illusions 1 and 2, which he did in the style of the Dick Smith book, which I didn't know about at the time, those were hugely instructional for me. Like, this is a pre-internet era. And so if you could, like, unless you had someone taking you on and showing you as a trainee, you had to learn this stuff yourself, and there just wasn't the resources that there are now. So yeah, I think Savini was and of course, once you know the name Savini and you can start looking stuff up, if you get your hands on a filmography, again, pre-IMDb, you get your hands on a filmography, then suddenly you're watching Martin and Maniac and Prowler and all these great like sort of 80s, very effects-centric horror films that really drive home the efficacy of this as a thing that one can do. So I think he was the first name that really stuck out to me. It's interesting. I don't know if I thought of Henson as an effects artist back then, like when I was a kid. Like Muppets and the puppet stuff, and even Dark Crystal and Labyrinth felt kind of divorced. Like it's in the early version of my understanding of the industry, it was very much more about horror. And I think probably Mrs. Doubtfire was the first movie where I realized that there was a space for it outside of the horror genre. And I think that was one of the ethoses behind the makeup in Mrs. Doubtfire, was the idea that this was something that could be brought to a non-genre audience.
Cool, I didn't realise that. So you're saying Savini as well also has one of the best weapons I've ever seen on cinema, with his cock gun and From Dusk Till Dawn. Still don't know how that works. He must have had a button somewhere. That was actually the first time I even kind of knew who Tom Savini was. And then as you said, you look back at things like Maniac and that, and he's still going today, isn't he? I'm not just...
Yeah, he's teaching mostly and doing a little bit of acting. I don't think he's done much in the way of sort of makeup design. I know that so Greg Nicotero was his assistant in the same way that, Bottin was Winston's assistant, and then Winston was Dick Smith's assistant. And there's, especially in America, there's always been this sort of like rolling tide of talent. And then when Nicotero and Kurtzman and Berger set up K&B, they invited Savini out to LA to join them and be part of that, and he refused to leave Pittsburgh. And I've never heard him say that he regrets that, but I can't imagine. Looking back on it, it feels like the best idea. Because obviously, K&B became one of the biggest names, especially in genre stuff, for a long time. But I think they still, they still have a connection to him, and he still does stuff with them, and he teaches through them. So he's definitely still a figure out there. But I don't know if he cast the length of shadow that he once did.
Yeah, that's interesting. I didn't realise he'd never wanted to kind of branch out to LA, I suppose, as you said, where he admits it. Is it a regret or not? But LA is obviously the kind of the hub for that sort of breakthrough. Looking at your
back then as well, it was much more centralized. I think, like the sort of the modern world has been able to be a lot less centralized around that stuff. People can work from further afield.
Yeah, do you think that's helped yourself then?
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I've benefited. I've done a huge amount of stuff in the States. I've done a few American productions that have worked over here.
Yeah.
And I've shot 2 pictures in the continental United States. I've done quite a bit of stuff in Canada. But when I work with American production companies, it's mostly because they're shooting in Europe.
Right. Okay.
And to some extent that has been fucked by Brexit because we don't have the visas anymore. But England's always had and I think that this is actually a lot of this is to do with Henson, but England has always had a very strong reputation for very high quality practical effects, be it miniatures or puppets or or prosthetics, any of that stuff. We've been very lucky in being very well regarded, and that stuff that carries a weird residual weight. That's like a silent voice in the back of people's heads out there in the industry. So on Possessor, I got to go out to the States. I got to go out to Canada to work on that, and that was because that was a UK and Canadian co-pro. So that was going to be shot in England when I was first attached to it, and then the funding body changed, and it was going to be split between the two countries, and then eventually it was shot entirely in Canada. But by that point, I'd been doing R&D and working with Brandon and Rob and Karim for 2 years. And they kept me on, and I got to go over there and work on it, and that was absolutely amazing. And then when we did Infinity Pool, that was a Canadian, Hungarian, Croatian co-pro, and England had left Europe. So I wasn't eligible for any of the tax incentives that came with that. And I think Brandon was allowed one HOD that wasn't either Canadian or Hungarian or Croatian.
Okay.
And he chose me, which is incredibly flattering.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, like, so I've been lucky in that I get to travel around for work and I get to do stuff. But obviously, the deciding factor is almost always going to be funding, where the money comes from. If it's an English film or if it's a film with English money, it's going to be much easier for me to work on it than if it's a foreign film. But like, again, now that we're in with all this streaming stuff, all of these companies have like sub companies in all the different countries. So like Netflix isn't just an American company. If Netflix is making a film in England, it's an English company making it, because Netflix UK is a separate entity for tax purposes, so that they can get those rebates and those tax deductions. So I had a picture that was going to be shooting in Spain this summer that got put back, as far as I can tell, because of the writer's strike. I think they wanted some redrafts, and that just wasn't viable at the moment. Not that I resent that at all. I wholeheartedly support the strikes. But it now looks like that's probably going to get pushed till next year. But that was being done through the UK arm of an American streaming service. So it was a UK production that was co-proing with Spain for tax reasons. So it was ostensibly a Spanish and English finance package. So all of I was talking about having a key artist working with me who would be local, and we were talking about other HODs who, as long as they paid tax in Spain, they were eligible. So
cool. You touched a wee bit there. Obviously, you worked with Brandon Cronenberg in Infinity Pool and Possessor. Just looking at some of your other things, you've said you've worked a few times with Ben Wheatley as well. A Field in England and Free Fire. Just again, some of the things. But you also worked on one of my kind of a favourite of mine in terms of found footage, the Borderlands.
We're going to be doing some. It's the 10-year anniversary of the Borderlands. We're going to to some screenings of that. We're partnering up with Evolution of Horror to do a UK screening of that later in the year. And a couple of festivals around the UK we're going to be showing it as well. And we're going to do we're trying to organise at the moment a screening down in Chislehurst Caves, which was one of the main locations for the Borderlands. Nice. So we'll be doing a subterranean screening of Borderlands where the ending takes place.
Yeah, without going into too much detail in the ending, that was one of the most kind of really inventive ways to end a found footage movie of that kind of type. It just totally blew me away. Didn't expect that. It was wild.
Yeah, it's one of the films I've worked on that I'm most happy to sit and rewatch. I love that film endlessly. My wife had done so my wife's Jennifer Handorf. She is a producer. She's directing now, but she did a picture called The Devil's Business, which was like a little micro budget thing that she did with a writer-director she'd worked with a couple of times before, called Sean Hogan, and they'd sort of been burnt by a production deal that they worked on together, and they were like, we just want to make fucking films and do it free of all of the oversight of all the baggage that comes with a budget. So they did this tiny little picture. It did quite well on the festivals. It got picked up by Metrodome in the UK. Mondo Macabro put it out in the States. Like, it's got it got a decent amount of play for a tiny little film. But Metrodome asked Jen if she'd come on as a sort of production consultant, because they were a distribution company, but they were getting into production. And they had a script in the works called The Borderlands, and they asked Jen if she'd produce it, and she read it and she said, this is solid, the ending needs a bit of work, if I can do a rewrite, I'd love to come on board. And they said, yeah, fine. And that's kind of how The Borderlands happens. And obviously, I'm married to the producer, I get the gig. But it was really exciting being with it from that early on, because I mentioned being on Possessor for a couple of years, and it stalled a couple of times because of finances. But Brandon was always very good with any advances he got. He'd spend some of that on R&D, and we got to do a load of development. But that's very, very rare. With Borderlands, that was because it was also comparatively early in my career. That was one of the first films where I really got to be involved that much that early because of Jen's involvement in it. And so that was really fun. So shaping that, I was flicking through my phone the other day, and I found if I say this next sentence, it's a massive spoiler for the film. But
We can put a note
I'll
in, I'm sure.
allude to it, and those who know. If you haven't seen Borderlands and you don't want it spoiled, skip forwards 30 seconds. I found cross-sectional anatomy of an old god
Right.
that I'd drawn as part of pre-production, so that we could work out the geographical layout.
And for something with that, obviously, with it being found footage, and does that change your approach to how you would design something? Obviously, if it's on film, the way like Infinity Pool, like Possessor is, where there's different. I'm sure I don't have a huge movie industry kind of knowledge or database, but is that like you've got to approach it a different way, tackle it kind of differently?
I mean, yes and no. The thing about anything found footage is you're going to be faking a single continuous shot for a lot of these gags. So you've either got to design in hidden edits or you've got to do hot swaps. One of my favourite special effects, and it's not even really a special effect, it's a prop gag that we did for Borderlands, is when they're walking through the graveyard outside the church, and eagle-eyed viewers will notice that they walk past a gravestone that has a little crucifix on it, a little four-pointed cross, and it says Grace Parks and a date. She was loved, whatever. And the camera shifts. It's all all handheld. Eben Bolter was doing the cinematography for it and did a beautiful job. I think one of the reasons it's such a prevailing success as a found footage movie is that the found footage aspect of it always makes sense. Like, it feels connected, it works. So that camera's following Rob Hill along. You see that gravestone, he looks up, the camera moves up, and then it swings back, and as it swings back, just at the bottom of frame, if you really if you see it, you can pause it. The gravestone's changed, and instead of Grace Parks, it says Gray Parker, and instead of the four-pointed cross, it's a three-pointed sigil that is the sigil of the old cult that they are about to find out about.
Right.
And instead of She Was Loved, it says Taken Before His Time, and the date on it is the date that the film was made. And all I did for that was I made a two-sided gravestone, and we left shot for 8 frames, and I could just reach in and flip it, and then it was. But it's that kind of sleight of hand, and like I said, being a magic nerd when I was a kid has paid dividends, because all of this stuff is just magic tricks, and I think that a lot of the best makeup effects, or the best gag effects at least, are based on selling something false to an audience and then pulling the rug out from under them. It's not enough to just show them something shocking. You've got to lull them into a false insecurity, or make them invest in the shot. Obviously the script and the director have made them invest in the characters, but you want them to invest in the shot before you pull the rug out, because that's always going to magnify the efficacy of these gags hugely. I think that's the backbone of a horror effect.
Yeah. When you started talking about that there, I haven't actually noticed that when I've watched it, but I did read about it. It was one of those articles about here's what you might have missed in the Borderlands, or explaining the ending and things, and it brought that up. And as soon as you started talking about it, I remember reading about it. But I'll need to check it out next time I give it a rewatch. Found footage is my kind of go-to subgenre. So,
lovely. Yeah, we still have that graveyard is in our garden, so I might drag it along to one of the screenings.
You've got to. And just change it halfway through the movie and see if anyone notices. So he said, obviously, again, touching the Cronenberg with Infinity Pool, which was out early this year. I saw it is wild. I think it's a concept that I'd never really seen done on done on film before, the kind of idea behind it, and working in Possessor, which at the time I absolutely loved. I still do love it, but I mean, the year that it came out, it just had such a kind of an impact. It was so visually sort of disturbing, I think. Possessor. How was the kind of, obviously Brandon Cronenberg comes with a reputation because he's dad and the there's a horror great. Was there any sort of not worry or trepidation, but maybe a bit of nerves working with someone. Again, not because of his name, but it's quite hard to the words I'm trying to use for it. But getting
there's family baggage. Like there are assumptions that people make because of who his father is. It's interesting. I mean, I've become friends with Brandon since we made Possessor, and we've talked about stuff. We've never talked hugely about his father. I think it's undeniable that there are connections. He grew up around stuff. Brandon worked on special effects for Existenz. Like that was something he was going to go into effects for a while. And you'd be naive or a liar to say that there wasn't some like conceptual connections between them. But I think that if you break it down to its raw ingredients, its raw elements, Brandon is doing a very different version of that thing. There's in the broadest sense, it's still horror, it's still grotesque, it's still body horror. But I think that the themes that Brandon is playing with are very much his own, and they're going to be born out of his experience and his life, which obviously includes his father. But I don't think he's copying his father at all, and I think that's really important. I was introduced to Brandon by Andy Stark, who was one of the producers on Infinity Pool, but is also one of Ben Wheatley's partners at Rook Films, who produced many of Ben's pictures, starting with Down Terrace. And Andy's fucking incredible. Like, I love working for Andy. He's a fantastic producer. He's very, very supportive of his projects. He doesn't take on anything he doesn't fully believe in. And many of my favorite films that I've worked on have been because of Andy. Andy's always had a lot of faith in me, which I am very, very grateful for. Although Andy wasn't on the film by the time we finished it, Andy was attached in the early days to Lords of Chaos, so it's because of him that I got to meet Jonas. It's through Andy that I did Earwig. It's through Andy that I met Peter Strickland. So he's really been an absolute a stalwart in my career progression. And Andy introduced me to Brandon, and we immediately got on. I got sent the screenplay for Possessor, like I said, a couple of years before we got to make it. And it, like, I read a lot of scripts, and you have to kind of attune yourself to the huge disparity between the experience of reading and turning a page in isolation and then everything that it can be, because unlike reading a novel where the images that happen in your head are the be all and end all because that's the experience that you have, when you have a film script in your hand, what you're trying to do is think of everything that could be done with every single one of those words by a huge team of people, all of whom are bringing their own ideas, their own baggage, their own experience to this project. And that can be like kind of tiring. Like it's a very interesting way to read things, but it's very different to reading a novel. Every now and then I get a script where all of that falls away and it's like reading a book because you're so involved in it. And I can always tell when I'm in love with a script because I finish it and I stopped taking notes halfway through because I just got too wrapped up in it. And Possessor was absolutely one of those. Like I knew immediately that I needed to be part of it. I was so excited to have that in my hand.
Yeah, it's an incredible film. I love the it's really unflinching and dark, a bit more so than Infinity Pool. I think there's certainly a lot more fun element to Infinity Pool than Possessor is. Bleak, and it's a hard watch but a great watch. I think at the time when I first... Sorry.
Oh, no, sorry, I didn't mean to cut across you.
No, not at all. I was just going to maybe reference, like, I think something that on my first watch of it, I had not long before seen Upgrade as well, and they're not the same film at all, but they felt very similar, and certainly in the violence as well, but very bleak kind of dystopian feeling to them.
Yeah, absolutely, and I think that one of the things, the people for whom Possessor doesn't completely work, and I don't mean people for whom that kind of film, like, where it's not their kind of film, but the people where it doesn't work is it's so unrelentingly dark. It's so miserable. It's so bleak, which I love. Like I cannot get enough of that. I know people who preferred Infinity Pool because it has that more sort of undulating tone where it moves through comedy into degradation of the characters and back up into a bit of relief, and it doesn't just fucking break you in the way the Possessor does. I mean, I absolutely love both movies, and you could ask me on 2 different days, and I'd tell you, two different answers as to which one of those films is my favorite. I think they both do spectacular stuff. I think the craft with which Brandon is able to not undermine his own work in Infinity Pool by being funny and then also like genuine like sort of dread and pathos is very good. It's one of the reasons that comedy horror is, I think, one of the more difficult subgenres of horror, because those two, like, there's loads of great comedy horrors I love that aren't scary, and there's loads of great horrors I love that aren't funny, but when you get one that actually manages to do both of those things, not that Infinity Pool is necessarily scary, I think it's uneasy, it's a disquieting film. And to be able to have those two things exist so well next to each other is very pleasing.
Yeah, it's both great movies. I can't wait to see what he does next. You spoke as well, working obviously with Ben Wheatley, who's certainly, I think, this country's one of the more eclectic filmmakers. He seems to like jump about. I mean, his next one's The Meg 2, which is, I remember hearing that, and that's such a strange directorial choice, but I can understand why they would maybe want to bring somebody with his a different take on maybe a blockbuster would be. So I'll definitely go and see it. But how is it working with someone like Ben Wheatley? I mean, the first of his I've seen would have been Kill List, which really disturbed me. Obviously, had Free Fire again, moving into something a bit more fun again. It's the kind of maybe similar in the not similar, but with the Possessor and Infinity Pool style, it a very different feel to the movies. Is he someone, again, as you said, you've worked with him a lot? Is it an enjoyable experience, really?
Yeah, I mean, it's hugely enjoyable working with Ben. I really enjoy our like pre-production chats. We'll text images and ideas back and forth, and we'll talk about stuff, and often we'll go off piste and talk about other jobs, other stuff I'm doing, other stuff he's working on, and that's always really enjoyable because it's all a melting pot. You can have an idea for one thing and it works for another thing, but like Ben co-writes with Amy Jump, his partner, his wife, a lot, and there's, I would say, the biggest changes draft to draft I've ever worked on a job. Like, you'll get a job, a script will come through, and you'll get maybe 2 or 3 drafts in pre-production, and then you go into production, and you'll get pages throughout, like, we've rewritten these pages, the blue pages have come out, the pink pages have come out, whatever. And little tweaks are being changed, scenes are being dropped, scenes are being combined, sometimes for budget, sometimes for pacing, whatever. I think Field in England is probably the film where the script changed the most in those things. Like, I would, conceptually the same, but content-wise almost unrecognisably from draft to draft. And that's always really exciting because I find rereading the smallest changed versions of the script, trying to find the tiny things that have shifted, quite hard work sometimes. Yeah. But when I get a new draft of one of Ben's films, it's always exciting because I know it's basically a new film.
Nice. And does that make your job a lot harder, or does he try and keep the kind of concepts that you've spoken about together kind of on point, or can it really change?
For example, I designed a beheading for Field in England that got written out of the script, and we didn't need it anymore. And we never got as far as making anything for it. But I'd come up with the concept of it structurally, technically. And then Julian Gilby gave me a call for his episode of ABCs of Death 2, Ears for Execution, or C's for Capital Punishment. I think they reordered them. And I got to use the beheading in that, and it's fucking horrible. I don't think it goes to waste. and production is savvy enough not to let like work start on a big gag if it's going to get cut.
Okay.
And I can imagine that there are probably guys out there, people in my position, who say, "Oh, well, I don't even want to read it until it's at a stage where everything that we're working on is going to get made." Because it's, they don't want to spend their time on it if it's not going to happen. But I just fucking love film, man. Like, why wouldn't I want to read every version of this script? Like, I just bought a load of unmade film scripts at an auction for sequels to movies that I love that never got made. Like, I've got down in my living room now, I have the sequel to Nightbreed,
right,
which never got made. But there was an auction of the effects artist. He passed away a few years ago, and they had an auction of some of his stuff. And I picked up a couple of screenplays for unproduced sequels and cool. Unproduced pictures, because I just care about this. Like, it all matters to me a lot still. I'm still basically just a fan at heart. I just get to make stuff as well.
Mm-hmm. Right, that's cool. That's I've never seen an unfinished script or anything like that. I've bought like a couple of the kind of tomes that get released with movies and things like that, but never anything like that. I just want to touch on a couple more credits. Now, I've went by IMDb, and I'm assuming it's more reliable than Wikipedia, but there's a couple it says uncredited on, and it was Batman Begins and Sunshine. So what was the kind of story with them?
Well, I mean, really, it's just that I was very junior. So, like, on a film that size, there's hundreds of people working, and there's a very limited number of credits that they're allowed. Even with the gargantuan scroll at the end of those pictures, not everyone is credited. Batman Begins, I was a trainee. I did a couple of weeks in the miniatures department. Cool. That was amazing. I worked on Ra's al Ghul's mansion, like up in the mountains.
Oh, nice.
Making like miniature bits of it for when it blew up, and I made a bunch of stuff for the inside of the Batmobile, for the inside of the Batcave, for the shots where the tumblers jumping through the waterfall, because that's all miniature. And then I did a bunch of stuff for Arkham for the scene where the tumblers like running down as all the like manholes are blowing up, all the sewers are exploding as the monorails. He's chasing the monorail across the roof. Yeah. But I just finished uni. I was a kid, basically. Like, that's why I don't have a credit on it. I worked on it, but I wasn't credited. Sunshine, I was brought in as R&D. I was recommended by one of the sales reps for a chemicals company that provide a lot of stuff for the effects industry, and they had sort of gotten wind of the fact that my favorite bit of all of this is problem solving, is like figuring stuff out. Okay. So when Sunshine was in pre-production, Mark Coulier, who was doing the makeup effects, had said, "Oh, we want some interesting takes on how to do the Captain, how to do the makeup effects for the Captain," and I was recommended to him. I don't think he expected me to basically be a child when I turned up. And I got there, and there were 3 different departments working on the light, like the glowing appliances for the Captain, and there was a group who were working on fiber optic light transfer. There were a group who were working on ultraviolet reflective pigments built into the makeup effects, and then there was me largely on my own working on using electroluminescent panel work. And this is before smartphones, so the tech I'm now describing is incredibly pedestrian now, because it's how they backlight phone screens, but at the time it was like emergent tech and wasn't really known about, and more importantly, it didn't benefit from the economy of scale that smartphones have introduced. So I was working with a signage company who I'd reached out to when I got this little job, and I did a bunch of R&D on making like super thin like light panels that could go underneath appliances. We did a bunch of tests with it, and they really liked it, and they asked how much it was going to cost, and I told them, and they told me to fuck off very politely. Because it was, it was all experimental stuff, and I hadn't been told what they had to spend. I just went away and solved a problem. And I learned a valuable lesson that day, which is that the pockets are not bottomless.
Sunshine's probably my second favourite Danny Boyle. I love that movie. After 28
film.
Days Later. Yeah. One of the TV credits I've seen, and it was a really interesting series that I've not watched in a while, was Utopia.
Now, Utopia was great fun.
Yeah, that was such a strange... was Ben Wheatley involved with that at all? Because it feels very Ben Wheatley. I don't know if it's just because the lead, or not the lead actor, but the...
You've got Neil and Michael, they're both in it.
Aye, Neil, Michael, Smiley, yeah. Just... It was such a unique series, I think, at the time as well. Before we were kind of just at the... Not at the dawn of the big telly that we've got nowadays, but certainly early doors into it. Was that quite an interesting concept to work on? I think I'd love to have seen one more series, I think, for it, because it had set up such a brilliant finale from the end.
Well, it was always going to do a third season, and then it just sort of fizzled out like these things do, sadly. Yeah, I mean that was a great one. I went in for some early meetings. I don't remember who put me up for that or how I got involved in it, but I'm not sure if Janie Levick was involved. Christian Milstead was definitely, I think, art director maybe, and maybe Janie was production designer. And by that point I'd worked with both of them on Sightseers for Ben, so I think it was probably adjacent to Ben, but I don't think Ben had any official involvement in Utopia. Yeah, it's a great series, and a great and actually Alex Garcia and Wayne Yip, who directed the second block, so episodes 4, 5, and 6. I'd worked on a short film for them before I ever worked with Ben as well, just by coincidence. So Mark Munden did the first 3 episodes, and then Alex and Wayne did episodes 4, 5, and 6. Cool. But it's a very small industry. You cross paths with people all the time.
Cool. So with the as you said, you do the kind of the puppet and miniature side of things as well. With someone like, in terms of keeping that side of the business alive, someone like Guillermo del Toro just now seems to be doing a lot of good work for that. Is it important that, certainly maybe in Hollywood and either side of the pond really, that it gets embraced in a way that he seems to certainly embrace it? He seems a very big advocate of practical effects. Obviously, I think I was listening to an episode of Empire, and they were talking about the kind of way CGI's evolved, and it might have been Chris Hewitt said that they were discussing really the difference between the latest Guardians of the Galaxy and the last Ant-Man. And because James Gunn uses a lot of practical effects that is then kind of maybe layered with CGI, that's how you get the best out of CGI. And then Ant-Man obviously is massively green screened. But is it important for us, someone like Del Toro, who seems to be a huge advocate of practical effects and the art of movie making, the classic style of movie making, for him to keep kind of pushing it forward?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if for anything to survive, it needs its advocates, because capitalism is a machine that eats itself, and the most cost-effective way will always be the way that wins, unless people have an artistic reason for pushing back against that decision. Obviously, Guillermo started out as a designer in practical effects and has moved into directing. He's always been a very strong advocate for practical work, and I think that's he's had a form of success where he's able to point to the practical stuff and say, but that's my look, like that's why I'm successful. So the studios don't push back as hard on him doing it as like maybe a first time director who would turn up and say, I want everything to be practical. Which is again why I think Possessor was such a blessing for me, because Brandon, like the decision was always that there would be no digital effects in that film, like everything's practical, and that was a really lovely like sort of flex, like a benchmark for us to do. But I think there's always going to be champions of the practical, there's some incredible digital artists out there. There's mind-blowingly good digital effects going on now. We're long past the days of all CGI being just bad, because it was for a while. But that's in the distant past, and there is a lot of really great stuff available. But I think that it's one of those things where it's a hybrid between the two that is almost always the best solution, because a practical effect, even if it's not 100%, it's still tangible, it's still real, it's still got real lighting hitting it in a real space, and even if it doesn't look fully realistic, it's still real, it's still a thing. And if a visual effect fails even a little bit, then suddenly it's not part of the scene, it's not there. And I think that's the thing that people, like some people, occasionally fail to realize, is that it's better to have a practical effect working at like 75% than a digital effect working at 90%, because the way in which the human brain perceives, and fuck, I mean, maybe this is gone, maybe this is outdated now, and kids these days are so used to digital that they don't mind it, and seeing a hokey visual effect is no different from us seeing a slightly hokey stop motion effect when we were young, But I do think that the physicality of it and the tangibility of it is so vital. And then you can use digital effects to add that spit and polish, or to composite things together, or to bring in particle assets that are so difficult to do practically, or to take out puppeteers, or all of that collaboration is so fantastic. But I guess the other thing is that the best visual effects are kind of invisible. Like, I think there's a lot of people particularly in horror, but in film watching in general, who are down on digital effects because they say, oh, they don't look good. But actually, all they're doing is they're reporting on the stuff that didn't work, and all the stuff that did look good, they didn't notice. And the flip side of that is, on Possessor, we had a lot of people assume that a lot of the stuff we did was digital, because now the language of cinema has developed in such a way that people assume a lot of stuff is digital if it's flawless. So particularly for the transfer sequence with all that melting and stuff, like, a lot of people just assume that was all digital, whereas it's actually entirely in camera. And not just my work either. Like, Karim Hussein, who's Brandon's cinematographer, is so fucking good at this, like, deep concept cinematography stuff, where, like, all of that stuff's being refilmed, like, they're projecting it and filming it back onto itself, they're creating analog image loops where they're forcing images back into themselves. So, like, what we make is just almost like a jumping off point, and then Karim and Brandon are able to explode it into this visual space. And I think that is what kind of happens with good digital effects as well, when it's working with practical, where you can combine those two worlds together.
Yeah. No, perfect. Yeah, it was just a thing I was wanting to touch on. Just as I said, I was listening to someone kind of comparing, as I said, Guardians and Ant-Man, which were two ends of the spectrum, I think, in terms of how they would have been made. So you're also, I noticed that also it's your Twitter profile as well, the Chainsaw Award winner twice. Is that both for Possessor?
No, I got the only time someone has won both creature effects and makeup effects in the same year. So we got creature effects for Colour Out of Space and makeup effects for Possessor in the same year. Colour
Out of Space, oh yeah, that was a great film. I loved that as well. The creature effect at the end, it was just so fucking mad. Nick Cage going Nick Cage. What more can you ask? And you've got as well the Arrow Video Pod. How long have you been doing that for? Do you still enjoy doing it as well?
Oh man, yeah. I'm still absolutely loving doing that with Sam. It's gone through many sort of iterations and shifts over the years. It's been, I don't know, like 5 years, 6 years, something like that. We've been doing that. Sam's, when we started it, Sam and I lived together. He was in Scotland for a while, in London, elsewhere in London. Now he lives in the States. He's married. But it's great. Really enjoy it. The guys at Arrow have always been incredibly supportive. Mike Hewitt, who's no longer with Arrow, who was our producer when we started, was sort of the backbone of the podcast. But since he's left, thankfully they've decided they wanted to keep us on. They saw some merit
Good stuff.
in our bi-weekly ramblings. It's really enjoyable. I really like doing it with Sam.
Yeah, they've got great stuff. I think the last Arrow thing I got was Battle Royale, maybe the recent.
Oh yeah,
that's
recent the 4K set or the
with this
the beautiful. And they fixed that one shot. They fixed that one fucked shot.
Is there a fuck shot in it?
Yeah. So way back, even in the cinema. So I saw that at Fright Fest 2.
Right. Okay.
Back in the day, the UK premiere of that, and then I had a Hong Kong DVD of it. It was the first print of it I had, and I've owned various DVDs and Blu-rays over the years. For a long time, I had both the Arrow HD Blu-ray and the Anchor Bay Blu-ray on my shelf, both of which had treated this one fucked shot in slightly different ways. And then the 4K came along, and it's the best job I've seen. I still don't know what was going on with that shot. It's when it's about, I'm guessing it's about 30, maybe 40 minutes in, and two of the female students are fighting in like a sort of greenhousey kind of space. One of them has two of the those sort of like sickles, the Japanese like ninja sickles. And one of them runs at the other and jumps past her and ends up doing sort of like a somersault. And that there's one shot in that where it feels like we're looking at, in like everything else shot on film, beautiful, lovely cinematography. Fukasaku knows what he's up to with a shot. And then there's this one shot that looks like it's been put together off the VHS dailies and just spliced in, and it's just fucking horrible. And it always just like really rankled me for some reason. And the 4K fixes it mostly.
So, I've not actually watched the 4K yet, so I'll definitely be looking out for that now.
That's not the reason to watch that film. I'm not winning any new viewers for that movie. It's a fucking masterpiece. Everyone should watch it. But they've finally fixed that one thing that annoyed me. I think.
I think the first time I got that would have been the early noughts with the Tartanasia boom, with that and kind of dark water and things like that. It was a great. Battle Royale 2. Do you like it?
Less of a fan. Bold opening sequence.
It's certainly it's a choice.
A little bit too much of the battlefield monologues for my liking.
Yeah, definitely.
But Kenta Fukasaku, Kenji's son, was an assistant director on the first one, so he was part of the original movie. And then obviously when Kenji died, he took over for the second one.
Yeah, I enjoy it for what it is. It's not, but the first one, as you said, it's a masterpiece. So how do you improve on perfection?
It was world changing. Yeah.
Yeah, it was great. Obviously, as well, you've done a few other podcast appearances, heard you in Evolution of Horror and Moving Pictures Film Club, I think, before as well. And is the podcasting, obviously, you really enjoy doing the Arrow one as well. It's just something you kind of enjoy doing, getting to talk movies. As you said, you are at heart a fan. That's your main reason for being in the industry, yeah?
Yeah, I mean, I love this stuff, and also, like, I think one of the things about the podcast is it allows me to some degree to steer the conversation. I'm very lucky in that I have a very talented staff at my workshop, but they're fucking children, most of them, and they haven't seen all this weird Eastern European sci-fi or all this strange Taiwanese horror or whatever it is I want to talk about. So when I get to go on a podcast, I'm talking about some fucking crazy horror film or some crazy sci-fi or fantasy film or whatever that I really want to talk about with someone, and that's a nice excuse for it. Yeah.
Good stuff. It's why I do this as well. My wife does not like horror movies, so that was the main reason I started it. So it's quite a difficult balancing act. I think I mention this every time I'm on, but I took her to see It Chapter 2 in the cinema after forcing her to watch It Chapter 1 at home, and said, I don't think she's ever got over it yet. And those aren't particularly scary, but for her, no, she's not having it.
Jen and I have joked about doing a podcast where just called Will Jen Hate It, where we'd record it in two chunks. I'd just enthuse about a film at her for about 5-10 minutes, and then we'd stop recording, watch the movie, and then do the podcast where she just watched it. And it's got to be a film I fucking love, but would she hate it?
I'd listen to that. That's a good concept. I'll write that down. So you've said as well there you've got the new studio just opening up. How's that been going? Just the setup? Is it obviously a bigger space and things like that for yourselves?
Yeah, it's a bigger space. The company owns the building, which is really exciting. So we're not going to get made to move on.
Yeah.
We've got a slightly more dedicated space for the sort of some of the more technological side of things that have become so incredibly prevalent over the last few years. So like 3D printing and all that kind of stuff, which is really good. Yeah, it's not a shithole. Like the old building was, we rented it down in Croydon. It was the building that British Aerospace used to make their engines in. A huge building, and my previous landlord had bought it, and then they sold the building that I was in like 10 years ago. And I moved with them down to Croydon, and it was fine. Like it was a big space. It was pretty affordable. We did a lot of good films there, but they sold the building about 4 years ago and then rented it back from the people that they sold the building to. And then it was like when they moved out, which I think they do in like a month and a half now, it's going to get knocked down. Yeah. So they immediately stopped caring about the building because it was no longer their responsibility. And like a frog in a pan of water slowly being brought to the boil, none of us really realised how fucking horrible that building was by the end until we moved into the new place. And it's like, oh yeah, do you remember this? Do you remember what it's like to have the windows aren't broken? It's not leaking. Yeah.
Help for your work environment as well, I'd imagine, on a working day. So obviously you're not allowed to talk about what's coming up and things like that, as there's scrides and scrides of NDAs, I assume.
Yeah, there's some fun stuff. We did a big horror picture for one of the big studios at the end of last year that I can't talk about, which won't be out until next year. But we did a bunch of unique creature designs for that. That was really fun. I got to work with a concept designer that I really like. And then around about the same time, just running one straight into the other, which almost killed all of us. We did a fantastic, slightly more indie horror picture that played at Sundance, but again, I can't talk about it. It's got an amazing cast. The director's someone you probably know the name of, who's great. And again, we got to do loads of like really big makeups for that, lots of big gore gags, and that was really fun.
No, so, I'm just going to go now and
I can't talk about it anymore.
I'm just going to go and Google lots of things that are maybe coming out in the next year and just look for creature designs or anything that has maybe been dropped that would drop the slightest hint. No, messy. Is it this? Is it this? Is it this? No. Brilliant. So, for yourself, for socials and everything, where can people find you in the studio and things like that?
So I'm on Twitter and Instagram under my company name, so it's at 13fingerfx. That's FX, the two letters. I go through fits and starts of posting a lot and absolutely not at all. Instagram is almost exclusively pictures of my work. Twitter is more pictures of my work and me occasionally fighting people who I disagree with politically. Because that's what Twitter's for, is for loudly being cross with people you don't know.
Waiting for Elon Musk to ban us all.
Oh, fuck yeah.
Magic. Dan, thanks very much for joining us. It's been a great chat and been looking forward to this for a while, so thanks very much for your time.
Oh, thank you. Thanks for having me on, and thanks for being so accommodating with my schedule as well.